Silent Hill is getting old. The series, and by extension the first game, has now passed the 25-year mark. Even though new entries continue to release, fans still point to the original 4 as the best the franchise has to offer. The general consensus is that the recent Silent Hill 2 remake and Silent Hill F are steps in the right direction, and some will even defend Shattered Memories or Origins. But no matter what, Silent Hill 1, 2, 3, and 4 always come up as the benchmark. But that raises the question, why bring these older games back into the spotlight? How could they possibly hold up against modern releases? Is it just nostalgia, or are people just blind? From an outside perspective, better graphics should make horror more realistic, and in turn, scarier. But I've talked before about how visuals can actually work against horror. The more realistic something looks, the less your imagination has to fill the gaps. Simpler, less detailed graphics force your brain to interpret what it's seeing, and that uncertainty fuels the fear. This is easy to see with Silent Hill 2, 3, and 4, which all came out during the 6th generation of consoles. But what about Silent Hill 1? Does it age too far to still be scary? Or can it still be genuinely unsettling? Sure, the visuals might be a bit dated for some. I get that not everyone likes the older look of 5th generation games. But Silent Hill still holds up. It's definitely aged, but most of the experience still feels surprisingly solid. Despite being such a big horror fan, I just played Silent Hill for the first time. It's mostly due to how limited access the game has been, with the only way to play it being on the PS1 and the digital release on the PS3. The physical disc for the PS1 is notoriously expensive, going for well over its original release price, so I wasn't able to add it to my collection for a while. Aside from PT, this was my first exposure to the Silent Hill series in terms of actually playing the games and not just watching a video on the series. Silent Hill is strange, unnerving even. It's not just scary, it's weird. The characters speak in odd, almost stilted ways. The world is buried in a thick fog and nothing ever seems to make complete sense. Silent Hill wants you to feel uncomfortable, and it uses your sense of familiarity against you. Take the voice acting for example.
But from what I can tell, something bizarre's going on. That's all I know.
The awkward delivery might sound like bad acting at first, but it's more likely intentionally designed to make everything feel just a little off. The fact that the later games kept this same unsettling style suggests it was a deliberate creative choice. And then there's the setting itself. Silent Hill itself is a small town in Maine that's been swallowed by fog and torn apart by massive cracks in the ground. This left its streets destroyed and a handful of people trapped inside. The fog makes it hard to see, and it adds to that constant feeling of unease. Not only does the fog limit your vision, but it also contributes to that almost claustrophobic feeling, even while outside in the open. It makes everything feel wrong, even the normal stuff. One of the game's biggest influences is Twin Peaks. You can definitely see that inspiration in its atmosphere and dialogue. The story of Silent Hill starts off pretty simple, and at first it doesn't seem like it could possibly get as confusing as the town itself. You play as Harry Mason, who's headed to Silent Hill for a vacation with his daughter, Cheryl. After a sudden car crash, the two are separated, leaving Harry with one very clear goal: find his daughter. It's a straightforward motive, and that's all that really matters to him. Even when the story starts throwing in monsters, cults, and entire shifts in reality, Harry's focus never changes. Save Cheryl. That simple motivation is what drives both you and Harry to explore this hellish town. Right away, the game will introduce you to the concept of the otherworld, a twisted, hellish version of reality. You're forced down an alleyway, and as the environment begins to darken, rust and blood start to coat the walls, and the world itself seems to decay. The alleyway stretches on endlessly, until you stumble upon a mangled corpse strung up against a fence. Then, out of nowhere, the first enemy will attack. There is no escape from this. Harry is overwhelmed, yet somehow he wakes up alive, sitting in a diner. Here, we meet one of the game's few other characters, Sybil Bennett, police officer from a neighboring town investigating Silent Hill's sudden radio silence. You catch a brief glimpse of her in the game's opening, implying she was trapped in the town around the same time as Harry was. After a short conversation, Sybil gives Harry a pistol, and once she leaves, the game truly begins. You can finally save your progress and scavenge for some key items: a map, flashlight, knife, and radio. Picking up the radio triggers the first encounter you can actually fight back in. The enemy, an air screamer, is one of the town's standard monster types, an early example of what's to come, but more importantly, the radio itself becomes a core mechanic. It acts as an early warning system, playing a distorted sound whenever a monster is nearby. Of course, the sound also alerts the enemies, so you can turn it off and sneak around. Personally, I found it better to just leave it on, since the game's camera doesn't always show where the enemies are right away. Silent Hill uses a mix of dynamic third-person views and fixed angles. Depending on the area, the camera either follows you loosely or frames scenes in a specific way to heighten tension. Often it'll intentionally hide something off screen just to make you uneasy. The more dynamic feel to the camera angles gives the game a sense of control and style that many other tank control games don't quite achieve in my opinion. Silent Hill is, at its core, a survival horror game. You'll manage limited ammo and health items, collect key items, and rely on maps to navigate. What really sets it apart is its puzzles. Some of them are genuinely clever, others can be downright tough. The piano puzzle is a standout, cryptic enough to challenge you, but fair enough that with a little patience, the solution feels rewarding once it clicks. That said, there are a few puzzles that get frustrating. Some require specific items you might have missed, forcing you to backtrack through large maze-like areas. One that really tested my patience involved retrieving a dagger from a fridge. You can actually trigger a game over if you don't have the right item. It's not bad design necessarily, but it's definitely punishing. This need to check every corner and revisit old areas is part of what stretches out your first playthrough. Silent Hill isn't a long game. Once you know what you're doing, it's quite short, which makes it perfect for multiple playthroughs, but your first run will take much longer thanks to exploration and puzzle solving. If you do explore thoroughly, you'll find plenty of ammo and health items. So much, in fact, that if you aren't on the game's hard difficulty, the game can feel overly easy combat-wise. Not to mention, once you get the hang of the melee timing, you don't really have to shoot at much unless you're in a pickle, or you're fighting a boss. The lower difficulty does take away a bit of the tension, but the atmosphere and sound design does an incredible job keeping the experience unsettling. Silent Hill's sound design is brilliant across the board. The music by Akira Yamaoka immediately sets the tone, and more or less builds the atmosphere for the entire series. It might seem strange of me to call a soundtrack good that is mostly comprised of songs that sound like this. But think of that tone that it sets. It's abrasive and chaotic, much like the town itself. Yamaoka's work blurs that line between music and noise, creating an environment that feels strange to its core. You're not supposed to feel comfortable listening to it. You're supposed to feel like the world is enveloping you, closing in. Even when the music doesn't sound like it's coming from the depths of hell itself, it's still weird, really putting that dreamlike feeling in play. So despite not being in a nightmare anymore, you still can't wake up from the dream. That's basically what Silent Hill is. A strange and uncomfortable dream that keeps dipping deeper into nightmare territory before coming back into a strange dream. In reality, this isn't some deep analysis. That's just what Silent Hill uses as a theming device. To be more specific, it's a representation of the sleep states. The fog world represents the first two stages of sleep, N1 and N2. In these stages, and primarily in deep sleep, the brain works to turn short-term memories into long-term memories through memory consolidation. Explaining the fog, the world is represented in the form of a memory. The fog is that unclarity in the world, rather the unclarity in the memories. Also in deeper sleep, bruxism occurs, teeth grinding. Bruxism is heavily tied to stress and the emotional state. We can kind of see that as some monsters. Disturbances in the dreams caused by strain of the mind. The other world is then the other two stages of sleep, N3 in REM, or rapid eye movement sleep. In stage 3, it is considerably harder to wake up from your slumber, and in this stage parasomnias occur, like night terrors or even sleepwalking. Then into REM, the brain enters a state where the brain activity is similar to being awake. In this stage, you are most likely to dream, and you aren't getting much rest compared to the other stages. Compare this to the game with its shift into the other world. Memories become dreams, distorting reality for the worse. What were twisted memories shrouded in a blanket of fog become a nightmare warped in darkness. It's also worth noting that it is reported that people that had awoken from stage 3 experienced mental fogginess, so leaving the nightmare world only makes sense to put you in a fog world. So why all of this sleep and dream mumbo-jumbo? This is someone's mind manifesting a twisted reality, influenced by their thoughts, emotions, and trauma. A lot of this theming and even the narrative structure is likely just to reinforce its psychological horror. So it's more than just scary monsters, scary. It makes things weird and uncomfortable to reinforce that. This is one of the reasons why the original Silent Hill still holds up as a horror game. There are a couple elements to the game that may be in the air as to whether they've aged well or maybe they weren't that great to begin with. And to be fair, the game is not perfect, but I do want to defend it a bit, and some of the aspects it may get flack from. The first thing that comes to mind when you think of a retro game not aging well, you would think of audio and visuals. Well, I've already talked about the audio, and it's fine. Sure, the series would improve over time, but in some ways the limited audio quality worked in this game's favor. The dialogue is intentional, so there's no sense in tearing it apart that way. So to the visuals then. I've talked a bit about this already, but it's a PlayStation 1 game, so the visual elements are limited. So they do have to work hard to hold that fear factor. The game being covered in fog or darkness certainly works to the game's favor here. Not only are things obscured, but the pixelated look of the game leaves room for interpretation of the mind to do some thinking about what it's looking at. Like I had talked about in the beginning, your mind has to pull some extra strings to comprehend things. It does end up helping raising that tension and dread. I mean, it's obvious, the longer you think about something frightening, the more those thoughts will be in your head. Again, that's something that's perfect for the psychological side of things too. It's all about the, what was that? Part of horror. But yes, I do hear you. Retro graphics aren't for everyone. That's why modern horror games don't really go for an art style. They just make things look real, especially when it comes to body horror. Having more realistic graphics is more disturbing, but there's ways to make horror games still scary with an art style, and PS1 horror has become a bit of an art style as of lately. Just look at Crow Country, Mouthwashing, or Fear the Spotlight. It's a testament to how Silent Hill works. The set design itself is great, filled with details. The menu and text screens have a lot of personality. The only spot I think they might be a little lacking is in the character and enemy models. They can just look a bit goofy. Like they're missing a little too much in terms of detail. The monsters can still jump out at a moment's notice or linger in the distance to give a good fright. But when they're up close and personal, they can seem a bit odd. And to go off of that a bit more, the animations definitely have a stiff, awkward quality to them. The controls aren't exactly smooth either, but honestly, that's probably more intentional. The clunky movements make it harder to stay in control during tense moments, which in turn makes panic feel a lot more real. When something lunges at you, you scramble and overcorrect. Harry isn't a trained marksman. Not to fully excuse bad controls, movement and positioning can be a bit much to excuse at times. But again, they're not outright bad. That said, I don't think Harry needs to stick his butt out quite that much every time he swings a metal pipe. It just looks wrong. It's charming in that old school jank way, but definitely goofy. The other element that I would say may have not aged perfectly is the overall structure of the game. The general loop is that you would explore the town of Silent Hill, solving puzzles, running from what are essentially demons, but then you'll find areas that are basically dungeons, like the hospital or the school. It's a good way to sort of set up the flow with the ups and downs. You enter somewhere like the school, explore, find items, solve puzzles, learn about the story, fight a boss. Then you're back to Silent Hill to find the next area and repeat. By no means does a game have to follow that structure, but it starts with the school and then right after the hospital. But then you'll end up in the sewers with no direct boss. The game doesn't need a structure, but it set one up that I was kind of excited for, but then it dropped it for a more loose structure. So maybe it's a bit more of a personal nitpick than an actual criticism, but I still think the second half of the game in the resort area of Silent Hill is a bit strange. You don't need to do a whole lot here. There's a pretty important side quest, but you can run straight through this area to get to the last area pretty quick. But then the final dungeon reuses the hospital. There were a lot of loose threads left there from the last visit, and the otherworld elements start going crazy this time around, but it is a little bit of a letdown to be in familiar territory for the finale. The next thing I really want to discuss is the story, more specifically the characters and how they affect the story. Everything Harry does is to save Cheryl.
Let me ask you, have you seen a little girl around here?
It's really awesome that Harry is all about making sure his daughter is safe, even when the odds are stacked against her survival. But that's all Harry really amounts to. He's a good dad, there just isn't much depth to him. He did lose his wife, so he's raising Cheryl on his own. But that doesn't seem to extend too much into the game story. But this blandness isn't exclusive to Harry. And then there's Sybil. Sybil is a cop. A good one it seems, but again, that's all. The other characters you'll run into in Silent Hill are a bit more of note. The first is Dahlia Gillespie, a frantic, almost prophetic woman who talks in cryptic warnings. It's not too long before you find out she's tied to the Order, the strange cult that lurks behind much of Silent Hill's chaos. Dahlia's past is a bit tragic. She reportedly lost her daughter Alessa in a fire, and that pushed her over the edge. She's unsettling, but in that quiet, unpredictable way where you're never sure if she's helping you or manipulating you. Then there's Dr. Michael Kaufman, a man who's very deliberately out of place. He's blunt, professional, and doesn't show much emotion. He's just as mysterious as Dahlia, though his story comes into focus much later, especially if you dig into his side quests in the resort area. It's there that you start to see his cracks in his demeanor, and you'll learn how deeply he is tied to this town. Lastly, there's Lisa Garland. She appears sporadically, almost out of nowhere. But she's the only one who really feels trustworthy aside from Sybil. She's a nurse from Alchemilla Hospital, the same place Kaufman worked. She actually talks with Harry, trying to make sense of everything. That human vulnerability is what makes her stand out amongst all these strangers. I purposefully left out Cheryl and Alessa, because their stories are much more central to the core mystery of Silent Hill. To put it simply, they are the heart of what's happening. The Fog World and Otherworld both exist as reflections of Alessa's mind. Pain, her memories, her nightmares, shaping the world around Silent Hill, but it's all part of the Order's dealings, even if Alessa wasn't a willing member. Dahlia and the Order wished to bring the birth of a god, or an entity known as Samael, so in a ritual to bring forth their deity, Alessa split her soul to stop the ritual from being a success, creating Cheryl, the baby Harry and his wife find in the field and inevitably adopt. So the whole reason Cheryl asked a vacation in Silent Hill was to become one with her other half. Alessa needed to become whole to perform her own sacrificial ritual that would completely stop the Order. But of course that doesn't happen in the end, as Harry's being manipulated by Dahlia, and he ends up stopping Alessa. There's a lot more to it than that. That really is the simple version of it. But you won't learn a lot of this super straightforward. Little hints are dropped throughout the game, and some cutscenes will show key moments. But without all the pieces, it won't make a lot of sense. It's another reason to replay the story, but it can still be a bit confusing to understand all the moving parts. Like Kaufman's role. You learn a lot about it during that side quest. He's involved in a major drug scheme in Silent Hill. That ends up being the major way the Order got its funding. The drug is something directly used in their rituals in its herbal form, a flower called White Claudia. The drug ended up affecting the whole town, extending to even Lisa. It's very likely that Lisa died from an overdose. Her existence in Silent Hill is possibly due to her dying shortly before the Otherworld became active, trapping her soul there. The ending of Silent Hill is directly tied to your actions throughout the game. There are two things that you can do to really influence the ending. The first is pick up some liquid off of the ground in the hospital and use it against an infected Sybil. The other is the Kaufman side quest, leading to a total of 4 main endings, with one joke ending being unlocked after beating the game once. There are 2 good endings and 2 bad. You'll get the bad endings if you don't do the Kaufman side quest, and you get the good plus or bad plus ending if you save Sybil. It's a little bit confusing at first, but take the baseline as the Kaufman quest, and saving Sybil as the bonus part. She isn't ever mentioned in the series' future, so her surviving the events of Silent Hill 1 are likely not canon. In the game's bad endings, the final boss takes the form of the Incubator, a fusion and rejoining of Cheryl and Alessa, as well as the mature deity. In contrast, the good ending sees the deity expelled from the rejoined Alessa, transforming the final battle into a fight against the Incubus, a demonic figure that might be Samael himself. These fights can be pretty manageable if you've been conservative with your ammo throughout the game. No matter what ending you get though, Alessa's fate is sealed. She dies in every outcome. Meaning no matter what, Harry will lose his daughter. But in the good endings, there's a little bit of hope. Alessa is reincarnated, and that rebirth carries forward into Silent Hill 3. It's a small bit of light at the end of an otherwise bleak story. Overall, the story is very strange. Fitting, right? I like it a lot. Even though it's not exactly my favorite kind of horror narrative, what really sticks with me is the sheer weirdness of it all. It makes everything feel more intense and lingers in your mind longer. It probably helps that I'm a huge fan of stuff like Twin Peaks. Silent Hill feels like the video game equivalent of that same surreal, uncomfortable atmosphere that David Lynch is known for. But as I've mentioned, it's so much more than just a story. It's world building, the visuals, the music. All of it works together to mess with you in subtle ways. It disorients you, confuses you, pulls you deeper into its nightmare. And the way it does that, the way it gets inside your head, it's what makes Silent Hill such a brilliant experience even after all of these years. This being my first real dive into Silent Hill, I have to admit my expectations were pretty high. For the most part, it met those expectations. It held up better than what I expected in a lot of ways, but it did still fall short in some areas too. Mostly just the second half of the game. The sewers onward felt different from what I had already gotten used to about the game. That and honestly the monster designs weren't anything crazy to me. They're all based on a child's fears. So you get the rabid scary dogs or the big bugs, but the most creative ones weren't much more special to me. Final bosses were rather interesting. And while basic, it was rather daring to put actual children enemies in the school. It makes sense why these guys were removed from the PAL and Japanese versions of the game. Also, the story probably could have used a bit more fine-tuning to blend everything together and give Harry and Sybil more depth. They work for what the story needs them to be, but they never really feel like fully realized people. Harry's single-minded determination is understandable, but it makes him come off a bit flat. Sybil has potential too, but she's mostly there to get the plot moving forward, rather than stand out on her own. They are both serviceable characters and a great story, but they aren't the reason I would remember Silent Hill.
The controls also could have been tuned up a bit more.
But they aren't awful. You get used to them, even if the clunky movement wasn't intended to be as clunky. And honestly, even with its rough edges, there's a lot to love here. Silent Hill 2 might be the fan favorite. I can see why. But the original is what made all of that possible. It's the foundation. It's messy, but it knows what it wants to be. There's something so intriguing about how it manages to mess with your feelings. It takes a different approach with the setting and tone. For me, finally playing it after all of these years was worth the wait. Silent Hill proves that horror doesn't need to be realism to be effective. And that games age, but that age doesn't make them obsolete. Silent Hill still made me jump, and not with cheesy jump scares. It was that atmosphere and audio design that really made me feel the moment. Gotta say, I really missed out not playing this sooner.